The palace walls didn't just shake tonight, they shattered. What we are witnessing right now is not merely a leak, it is the total structural collapse of a narrative that has held the British monarchy hostage for nearly 5 years. Just moments ago, sources deep within the royal household confirmed that a sealed document, one that was never meant to leave the private archives of the late Queen Elizabeth II, has been exposed. And the person holding the match that lit this fire is the one person no one ever suspected, Princess Anne. For decades, Anne has been the vault, the stoic guardian of secrets, the one royal who valued discretion above all else. But tonight, that silence ended. The report that has just surfaced is being described by insiders as Queen Elizabeth's final warning. Attached to it are the confidential results of a DNA investigation that Meghan Markle reportedly fought with every ounce of her influence to bury. This isn't just about scandal, it is about legitimacy. It is about the very blood that flows through the veins of the House of Windsor. When the news broke, the atmosphere inside Buckingham Palace was described as absolute pandemonium. Senior aides were pulled from their beds. Emergency lines between King Charles and Prince William were activated. The initial reaction wasn't anger. It was a chilling, paralyzed shock. They knew the investigation existed. They knew the Queen had her doubts, but they never believed Princess Anne would weaponize it. To understand the magnitude of this moment, you have to look beyond the headlines. This wasn't a slip of the tongue during an interview. This was a calculated, military-grade operation to release the truth before it could be erased forever. Sources say that for months, Anne has watched from the shadows as the history of the monarchy was rewritten by PR firms in Montecito. She watched as King Charles, torn between his duty as a monarch and his guilt as a father, hesitated to draw the line. But the Queen's letter changed everything. Found tucked away in a private drawer at Balmoral, written in the final months of Elizabeth's life, it contained a prophecy that has now come terrifyingly true, that when secrets outweigh blood, the crown will crack. Meghan's camp is reportedly in a state of total meltdown. For years, they have operated on the belief that the palace would never fight back, that the institution was too afraid of being labeled cruel or racist to ever reveal the hard evidence regarding the lineage of Archie and Lilibet. They relied on the monarchy's never complain, never explain mantra as their ultimate shield. But they forgot one thing. Princess Anne is her mother's daughter, but she is also her father's soldier. She realized that silence was no longer dignified. It was complicit. The leak of the DNA results, paired with the Queen's handwritten warning, strips away every layer of protection Meghan had built. The specific details of the DNA report are complex and devastating, pointing to a clandestine verification mission that took place nearly 2 years ago, an operation so secret that even Prince William was kept in the dark until the final results were courier delivered to a senior advisor known only as the Fixer. The implications suggest that the children's connection to the direct royal line is not what the world was led to believe. And while the public is reacting with shock, the mood inside the royal family is one of grim finality. King Charles is reportedly sitting in his private study, the Queen's letter on his desk, realizing that the decision he avoided making for years has just been made for him. The mask has slipped, the fairy tale is over. And as the sun rises over London tomorrow, the question won't be about reconciliation, it will be about survival. To fully grasp why Princess Anne took such a devastating step tonight, we must peel back the layers of a secret operation that was never meant to see the light of day. This story didn't start with a leak. It started nearly 2 years ago, in the dead of night, behind the heavy velvet curtains of a royal residence. While the world watched public smiles and official ceremonies, a clandestine mission was unfolding within the palace walls, a mission that involved a discreet medical lab, a ghost courier, and a biological sample that held the power to dismantle the royal lineage entirely. This was the DNA test that Meghan Markle reportedly fought with every weapon in her arsenal to block. But despite her threats, despite her legal firewalls, it happened anyway. The origins of this operation read like a Cold War spy novel rather than a royal diary. It began with a visit by a royal medical consultant who does not exist on any official roster. This individual was not a standard palace physician. They were a specialist handpicked by one of the late Queen's most trusted aides just months before her passing. Under the pretense of a routine health check for the children, a small but highly sensitive sample was collected. What no one in the Sussex camp knew, except perhaps a suspicious Meghan, was that this sample wasn't for checking fevers or milestones. It was part of a high-stakes verification mission tied directly to the bloodline of two children who had ostensibly been removed from the royal ecosystem. Once secured, the sample didn't go to a London hospital or a known royal facility. That would have been too risky. Instead, it was transported by private courier to an off-the-books laboratory located outside the United Kingdom, a facility quietly used by intelligence agencies for sensitive international paternity disputes. There, the genetic material was processed under code names, stripped of any royal association to ensure absolute neutrality. It was a layer of secrecy so impenetrable that even high-level palace insiders remained completely in the dark. They knew something was happening, but they didn't know what, until the results were quietly returned to the desk of a senior advisor known in whispered circles only as the Fixer. When that dossier finally landed back in London, the conclusion it contained was so staggering that its mere suggestion threatened to ignite constitutional mayhem. The whispers that began to circulate in the shadows of Windsor weren't just gossip anymore. They were armed with scientific data. The question of whose DNA was involved became secondary to the terrifying realization of whose DNA wasn't. That was the spark that started the panic. The results raised immediate, glaring questions about the legitimacy of the paternal connection to the direct royal bloodline, a revelation that could ripple across royal protocol, titles, succession, and even financial rights. The moment Meghan caught wind of this covert test, the reaction was described as nuclear. She reportedly went into immediate crisis mode, unleashing her legal team to issue urgent notices threatening catastrophic action against anyone attempting to publish or even discuss the contents of the test. Multiple letters were fired off to senior aides and directly to Charles, warning of irreparable damage if the results were ever revealed. But the horse had already left the stable. Royal advisors found themselves paralyzed between protocol and conscience. Some argued that the truth should die in the vault to save the monarchy from shame. Others, like Princess Anne, insisted that silence was a slow-acting poison. And tonight, the poison has finally been purged. While the legal threats flew back and forth and the DNA results sat locked in a safe, a different kind of storm was brewing inside the palace corridors. Royal advisors, men and women who had steered the monarchy through divorces, fires, and deaths, found themselves completely paralyzed. The internal debate was agonizing. One faction believed that the truth should be buried forever, arguing that the damage of revealing it would be fatal to the institution. They whispered that too much had already been accepted, too many titles conferred, to turn back now. But there was another camp, a quieter but firmer group, who insisted that silence was not protection, it was complicity. They argued that the monarchy could not afford to anchor its future to a lie. And rising above this paralyzed confusion was one singular, unwavering voice, Princess Anne. For years, Anne has watched the institution she loves struggle to adapt to the age of celebrity spin and manufactured narratives. She has watched quietly as tradition was eroded by the demands of modernity. But this situation was different. To the Princess Royal, this wasn't about PR strategies or public image. It was about the very essence of the monarchy itself, blood. While others backed away from the fire, terrified of the heat, she stepped directly into it. The so-called Spare's sister had finally grown weary of the manipulation and the compromising of the crown's values. But even she needed a final catalyst to push her from frustration into open defiance. That breaking point arrived during a tense, closed-door summit attended by King Charles, Prince William, Camilla, and Meghan. According to leaked insider accounts, the meeting was intended to clear the air, but it quickly devolved into a power struggle. Meghan reportedly made an impassioned, almost demanding plea for her children to receive full HRH status, complete with state-funded security, titles, and inheritance privileges equal to those of Prince William's children. Charles, caught between his duty as king and his softness as a father, hesitated. William reportedly sat in stony silence, unwilling to stoke the fire further. But Anne did not hold back. In a moment that has now become palace legend, she allegedly slammed a folder onto the heavy wooden table, a folder filled with reports, timelines, and veiled warnings about the growing divide. Her voice, rarely raised in anger, echoed through the room that day. She drew a line in the sand that no one else dared to draw. It was the moment the dutiful sister became the defender of the realm. Following that explosive meeting, palace staff noticed a chilling shift in Anne's demeanor. She began using cryptic language during public engagements, making pointed references to diluted legacies and the importance of protecting bloodlines. In one particularly striking interview, she remarked that truth doesn't need applause, only courage. At the time, the press brushed these comments off as the musings of an older generation. But for those inside the palace walls, the message was crystal clear. Anne was preparing for a reckoning. She viewed the monarchy not as a malleable family brand to be exploited, but as a sacred thread woven through centuries of history. She feared that the core of that fabric was being tampered with for the sake of convenience and optics. She turned to Queen Elizabeth's old diaries for guidance, and what she found there confirmed her resolve. Preserving the royal line wasn't about exclusion, it was about ensuring stability and continuity. And she was no longer willing to let secrets threaten that stability. The simmering tension that had plagued the palace for months finally boiled over in a moment that changed the course of history. It wasn't the group summits or the legal letters that tipped the scales. It was a private, face-to-face confrontation between the Princess Royal and the Duchess of Sussex that sealed the fate of this secret. Sources described the encounter as nothing short of explosive. Meghan reportedly confronted Anne, accusing her of persistent coldness and institutional resistance against her family. But Anne, never one to be intimidated by emotion, turned the tables immediately. Instead of offering apologies, she demanded honesty. She demanded clarity. She reportedly looked Meghan in the eye and questioned the shifting timelines, the clouded motives, and the very paternity questions that the DNA report would later illuminate. The aftermath of that meeting was stark. Meghan reportedly walked away in tears, shaken by the directness of the assault. But Princess Anne walked away with something far more dangerous: resolve. That was the definitive moment the strategy shifted. There would be no more silence, no more polite backroom diplomacy. Anne decided that the truth had to come out, regardless of the cost, even if it shattered relationships, destroyed reputations, and disrupted the temporary peace within the family. The silent princess was silent no more. She realized that protecting feelings had come at the expense of protecting the crown, and that was a trade she was no longer willing to make. But this wasn't just about Anne's personal frustration. It was a response to a sophisticated machinery operating on the other side of the Atlantic. Meghan has always understood that in the modern world, image is power. Behind the public smiles and the curated photos, she had been working tirelessly to secure what she believed was rightfully hers and her children's. While the public saw a poised duchess and a devoted mother, palace insiders saw a full-scale operation designed to cement her footing within the institution she had left. This began long before the DNA whispers started. It involved strategic appearances, careful brand alignments, and interviews that were sculpted with surgical precision to validate her place within the royal framework. Every move from Montecito was calculated to reinforce a specific narrative, that her children were rightful heirs, deserving of the same protection, prestige, and power as any other member of the bloodline. To Meghan, titles were more than just fancy names. They were shields, they were leverage, they were legacy. When the first quiet rumors about the DNA test began to surface, Meghan didn't wait. She sprang into action. Her private PR teams were activated immediately to flood the media landscape with positive, sympathetic narratives. They highlighted her role as a protective mother under attack by an outdated, cruel tradition. Carefully timed headlines painted her as the modern outsider, facing unfair scrutiny, generating a wave of public sympathy. But while the press ate up the Mother Under Siege story, behind the closed doors of the palace, the walls were already cracking, and the truth was preparing to march out. While the public battle played out in headlines, a far darker war was being waged via encrypted messages and hushed phone calls. Leaked texts have now surfaced that reveal just how far the Sussex camp was willing to go to suppress the looming revelation. In one particularly chilling message chain, Meghan reportedly urged a high-ranking palace lawyer to simply make it disappear in reference to the internal report. In another, she explicitly warned of severe legal retaliation if any unverified data regarding her children ever reached public eyes. The tone of these messages was not desperate. It was urgent, controlled, and unmistakably commanding. She wasn't asking for help. She was directing an operation. Inside their California estate, crisis meetings became a daily routine. Prince Harry, torn between his loyalty to his wife and the crushing weight of his royal legacy, was reportedly caught in an emotional crossfire. U.S.-based legal strategists advised them to launch aggressive, preemptive lawsuits to silence the rumors before they could take root. However, more cautious advisors warned that the optics of suing the palace, essentially suing his own father, could backfire spectacularly. But Meghan was determined. She believed that protecting her children from what she termed a royal witch hunt justified every possible measure, no matter how scorched earth the tactics might be. But as the storm intensified, whispers of something even more sinister began to emerge from London. A senior palace aide, a veteran of the royal household, allegedly stepped down abruptly, citing deep moral discomfort with the situation. Anonymous claims suggested that this departure was linked to veiled threats coming from the Sussex camp, implying that compromising information about the monarchy would be revealed if the palace dared to undermine the children's future. The word blackmail was never officially used in palace briefings, but the tension was palpable. The implication was clear. If you come for our children, we will come for the institution. And looming large over every briefing, every strategy session, was one name: Princess Anne. Meghan knew better than anyone that Anne's reputation for silence was merely a facade for her immense power. She saw how Anne's influence was growing, how the staff had begun rallying around the Princess Royal as the true moral compass of the monarchy. Meghan's team reportedly flagged Anne as the single greatest internal threat to her standing. Every headline Anne sparked, every subtle gesture she made, felt like a direct assault on the future Meghan had meticulously planned for Archie and Lilibet. But while Meghan scrambled to contain the fallout from the outside, the palace had already begun shifting its focus to the innocent lives trapped at the center of this storm. They never asked to be royalty, yet Archie and Lilibet now find themselves unwittingly thrust into the heart of the most explosive scandal to hit the monarchy in decades. These two children, born thousands of miles away from the throne, were meant to be symbols of hope, a bridge between the ancient traditions of Buckingham Palace and the modern celebrity of Montecito. But today, their names echo through headlines around the world for reasons no child should ever have to bear. With Princess Anne's leak igniting a full-scale media and constitutional crisis, the narrative has shifted violently. Archie and Lilibet are no longer just children in the eyes of the institution. They have become pawns, questions, and consequences all at once. The stakes here go far beyond mere gossip. If the DNA report proves even a fraction of what insiders are whispering, the implications are nothing short of staggering. We are looking at a scenario where succession lines would need to be redrawn, titles rescinded, and the very foundation of trust within the family broken beyond repair. The monarchy, an institution built entirely on the preservation of bloodlines for centuries, is facing the ultimate betrayal, illegitimacy from within. And in the midst of this wreckage are two innocents, completely oblivious to the war being waged in their names. Predictably, Meghan and Harry went on a desperate defensive offensive. According to close sources, Meghan has been left emotionally shattered by the leak, fearing that her children will be stripped not just of their royal titles, but of their very identity within history. Prince Harry, meanwhile, has reportedly entered a deep emotional spiral. Torn between the undeniable truth looming over his family and the life he built across the ocean, he found himself paralyzed. Those closest to him say he has been revisiting old letters from his mother, Princess Diana, desperate for guidance in a world that feels increasingly hostile. Ironically, it is Diana's name that has been weaponized by both sides in this conflict. Meghan invoked her spirit as a mother trying to protect her cubs from institutional coldness, while whispers within the firm suggest that this chaos, this distortion of legacy, would have broken Diana's heart. The world is watching, and it is judging. Social media has erupted into a frenzy of opinion, sympathy, and outrage. Some blame Princess Anne for turning children into casualties of her own moral crusade. Others praise her for having the courage to defend the sanctity of the crown when no one else would. In this polarized storm, every royal watcher has become an armchair historian, debating whether two children born overseas ever had a legitimate claim to royal titles to begin with. Even within the palace walls, old alliances are cracking under the pressure. Camilla, according to several aides, was overheard making a cutting remark that bloodline doesn't come with a hashtag, a subtle jab, perhaps, or a confirmation of her long-held belief that the children never truly belonged to the world of the monarchy. The divide is no longer just about Meghan. It is about who the monarchy chooses to protect and what it is willing to lose to preserve its throne. And while the public waited with bated breath for the monarchy's next move, King Charles was about to take an action that would silence the room. In a private chamber shielded from cameras and advisors, the king stared at the DNA report lying on his desk. The names, the dates, the implications, it was all there in black and white. For the first time in decades, the monarch found himself paralyzed not as a king, but as a father, torn violently between duty and blood. He knew that his decision that night would fracture the family beyond repair, but he also knew he had no other choice. The silence in the room was deafening. Charles, a man who had navigated decades of scandal, betrayal, and palace games, was now cornered by something he could not spin: truth. And this truth didn't just threaten the stability of the crown, it struck at the core of his identity as a father. Protecting Harry had always been Charles's quiet internal mission. Even in the face of royal tension, even when Harry stepped away and attacked the institution, Charles had harbored a lingering desire to one day fix what had been broken. But now, that paternal instinct collided violently with a responsibility far greater: protecting the monarchy from crumbling under the weight of its own bloodline. Sources close to the inner circle say, that night, Charles requested Harry join him alone. No aides, no Camilla, no advisors, just a father and a son facing the abyss together. The confrontation was reportedly brutal. Charles presented the documents. Harry, blindsided and defensive, allegedly refused to even look at them. Voices rose behind the heavy oak doors. Years of buried pain resurfaced in an instant. Harry demanded loyalty. Charles demanded truth. And between them, the chasm only widened. There were no embraces, no tearful reconciliations, only a silence that hung heavier than any crown. Outside the room, Camilla waited with fury brewing. She had warned Charles for years about shielding Meghan, about allowing her continued influence to ripple through the institution unchecked. According to insider accounts, Camilla exploded in private, questioning how far Charles was willing to go to protect someone she believed had waged war on the family from within. "She's played all of you," she was overheard saying, "and now the price is blood." But Charles, knowing the media would soon pounce and the institution was on the brink of collapse, made a chilling administrative move. A secret clause was quietly inserted into a draft of an upcoming royal decree. While the language was coded and indirect, its intent was unmistakable. It outlined a narrowing of titles and privileges strictly to confirmed lines of succession, effectively allowing the palace to act decisively should the DNA fallout escalate into a public demand for clarity. Confidants say Charles, after signing the document, stared out the window into the London night and whispered, "This changes everything. Not just for the children, not just for Meghan, but for the future of the House of Windsor." The line between father and monarch had finally snapped. Inside the palace, lines were being drawn. Princess Anne and Prince Edward, who had already begun mobilizing damage control behind the scenes, fully supported Charles's secret clause. They insisted that preserving the monarchy's foundation meant confronting uncomfortable truths head-on, arguing that continued silence would only inflame speculation. Edward, typically more cautious, pushed for a statement rooted in dignity, but Anne knew that dignity alone would no longer suffice. But Charles's private administrative decision wasn't enough, because the timeline had already accelerated beyond his control. Someone else was already preparing to make the DNA results public in full. It was no longer a rumor contained within the palace walls. It was everywhere. Overnight, media outlets from London to Los Angeles splashed the same devastating headline: Royal DNA Report Exposed. The palace's worst nightmare had officially become a global spectacle, and at the center of this media inferno stood the whistleblower no one saw coming, Princess Anne. The leak didn't happen by accident. It started with a single, encrypted message sent to a high-ranking editor at a major British newspaper. Attached to that message was the full DNA report, unredacted, authenticated, and undeniable. Within hours, the file had been mirrored across servers, shared among global journalists, and blasted onto every platform imaginable. The speed of the transition from secrecy to explosion was breathtaking. Within 12 hours, every corner of the world had access to the genetic truth that Buckingham Palace had desperately hoped would remain buried forever. The reaction was immediate and intense. While some sympathetic voices framed the story as a brutal violation of Harry and Meghan's privacy, a much louder wave of fury demanded accountability, transparency, and answers. Opinion pieces flooded the internet, dissecting royal succession laws and casting doubt on how far back this deception might have stretched. The internet didn't just explode, it ignited. Meghan's legal team acted like a military unit under siege. Emergency court injunctions were filed across multiple jurisdictions in the US and the UK. Threats of lawsuits flew at publishers, media outlets, and even social media platforms. But the digital wildfire was unstoppable. Every takedown attempt only fueled public curiosity. Each suppressed link was reposted tenfold. The harder the Sussex team fought to hide the document, the more the world leaned in to see it. Back in London, King Charles was reportedly livid. The carefully managed containment strategy he had tried to implement had imploded completely. According to insider reports, he summoned his most trusted advisors, demanding to know exactly how such a catastrophic leak had occurred, and more importantly, how Anne had obtained and released the report without being stopped. An immediate internal investigation was ordered, one that would quietly but ruthlessly track every communication, every courier, and every staffer who had touched or even seen the file. Meanwhile, Prince William, who had tried to stay neutral publicly, was suddenly thrust into the spotlight. Pressured by both senior officials and the court of public opinion, he made a brief appearance at a charity event. His face said more than his carefully chosen words ever could. He spoke of unity and family healing, but the tension in his voice betrayed the truth. The foundation of trust inside the royal household was crumbling fast. Buckingham Palace released a statement the following morning. It was polished, guarded, and deeply cryptic. It neither confirmed nor denied the validity of the report, but emphasized the Crown's commitment to dignity, discretion, and familial privacy. To the public, it sounded like avoidance, a desperate attempt to buy time. But to insiders, it was a signal, a flashing red light, indicating that the institution was struggling to process its next move. But the media storm wasn't the final blow. The royal fallout was just beginning, and relationships inside the family would never recover. If the royal family was ever united, it isn't anymore. The DNA scandal wasn't just a truth bomb. It was a wrecking ball. The brothers, who once walked shoulder to shoulder behind their mother's coffin, now couldn't even stand in the same room. Trust was gone, and William's next move would ensure there was no going back. Harry reportedly refused to believe the evidence in front of him. From the moment the DNA report leaked, he denounced it as fabricated, manipulated, and an orchestrated attempt to discredit his wife and children. He reportedly told close friends that the palace had manufactured a lie to erase his legacy. Meghan stood by his side, but even her voice began to falter under the crushing weight of isolation. Once welcomed with reluctant curiosity, she now found herself entirely cut off. Senior royals stopped extending invitations. Calls went unanswered. The walls of the monarchy closed in, leaving only shadows behind her. William, on the other hand, was livid. He saw the scandal not just as a family betrayal, but as a direct assault on the crown itself. According to insider accounts, he told aides that Harry's refusal to acknowledge the situation had burned the last bridge. For William, this wasn't about revenge. It was about preservation, protecting the institution their grandmother had spent a lifetime building from being consumed by ambiguity and manipulation. He was done playing diplomat. Privately, William met with Charles and Anne to discuss an unprecedented move. In that meeting, for the first time, Prince George's name was raised not just as a future king, but as the potential anchor for stabilizing the monarchy's image immediately. With Archie and Lilibet's status now mired in scandal, the palace quietly began outlining contingency plans for a succession narrative focused solely on verified bloodlines. This wasn't about cruelty. It was about control. Inside the palace, whispers turned to concrete planning. Lawyers were consulted, and constitutional experts reviewed precedents. The term honorary status became a convenient shield, a diplomatic phrasing that would allow the family to strip royal titles from Meghan and Harry's children without triggering global outrage. Behind the scenes, it was agreed. Any such move must be executed softly, wrapped in compassion, but firm in purpose. The monarchy could not carry uncertainty into its future. Even Princess Catherine, long seen as the peacekeeper and the bridge between the warring brothers, stood silently beside Anne. Her loyalty to William and her belief in upholding the Queen's legacy outweighed any sympathy she might have once held. Sources close to her said she viewed the leak as painful but necessary. Her public silence only amplified the message. Catherine had chosen a side, and as for Harry and Meghan, they stood alone. The fracture wasn't just personal, it was permanent. No amount of apology or repair could undo what had been done. The brothers, once symbols of a modern monarchy, now embodied its deepest divide. But in the midst of this institutional ruin, one final twist emerged, a secret hidden in a second envelope that Princess Anne never meant to reveal. Just when the world thought it had heard everything, another letter surfaced. Dated years before the DNA leak, it was written by Queen Elizabeth II herself, sealed, personal, and eerily predictive. In it, she wrote of her deepest fear, that secrets like these would one day shake the foundations of the crown. With Anne's final reveal, that prophecy became reality. The letter had been hidden in a private drawer, passed quietly to Anne just months before the Queen's passing. It was never intended for public consumption, never to be weaponized. But in the wake of the scandal, Anne found herself holding not just a document, but a moral crossroads. The words penned by the late monarch were haunting. In them, Elizabeth expressed her growing unease about unverified lines entering royal succession, and how, in her words, blood may be questioned when power is diluted by secrecy. She had anticipated chaos, and she left instructions should this day ever arrive. Elizabeth charged her daughter not with vengeance, but with stewardship. She asked Anne to act only if truth collides with legacy. And now, with the world spiraling and the monarchy cracking, Anne saw no choice but to execute her mother's final wish. Contained in the letter was a contingency plan few knew existed. If the bloodline was ever called into doubt, the Queen proposed a transition framework, ensuring the royal line could re-establish trust without constitutional collapse. It was a guide to preserving the crown while quietly disassociating from scandal. The strategy included naming Prince William as the symbolic anchor of the monarchy's future, and shifting public focus entirely to the next generation. George, Charlotte, and Louis, while respectfully disengaging from those whose roots are now uncertain. When Meghan learned of the letter, sources say she broke down completely. In private, she reportedly screamed, "Even the Queen doubted us." For Meghan, this wasn't just a blow. It was annihilation. Her battle to protect her children's legacy had just been invalidated by the matriarch she had always hoped to win over. Harry was said to be inconsolable, stunned that his grandmother, who once called him her joy, had penned such a message in secret. He didn't speak to Anne for days. Meanwhile, the public reaction split down the middle. Some viewed the Queen's words as a prudent warning, a leader safeguarding the institution she had sworn to uphold. Others accused the monarchy of premeditated cruelty. Debates ignited across social media, in parliaments, and around dinner tables. Was this royal preservation or royal punishment? But one thing became clear. The Queen's letter gave William unshakable moral ground to move forward. In his next private audience with the Archbishop of Canterbury, William reportedly quoted the Queen's phrase directly, "Truth colliding with legacy." The future reign had found its foundation not in scandal, but in the steady hand of a monarch who saw the storm long before it hit. As the monarchy reels from Anne's explosive decision, one thing is certain: the royal family will never look the same again.